So high level, this is the old way. This is all the tasks that it takes to install ADF and Orchestrator Studio. So again, if you have an existing Oracle 12c database, you can use that as a Fusion middleware repository. And like I said, if you're a 400 customer, or back in the earlier days before they supported SQL Server, you couldn't put the repository there. So again, what I did is I just took the OEE 12c database, the one we use for the fact clients and all that. It's a limited runtime license for JD Edwards, and put that on your ADF server. So that becomes my repository. Then some of the things, the XML path, we'll talk about that. Again, for the Orchestrator client, there's a piece where we have to disable the what's called basic HTTP authentication. All that means is WebLogic allows you to type name and password in at the HTTP layer. We don't want that turned on because we want it to go to the security server and use your JD Edwards name and password. So that only applies to the Orchestrator client if you're doing that, talking to it. Then the steps, high-level steps. Most of these steps I'm talking about right here, all the way down to creating the ADF server instance through the database schemas, extending a domain or creating a domain, and a managed server in the template. That's the stuff everybody has to do. So then below that, this is where Server Manager comes in. All these manual steps, I'll show you the detail of it, and that's, I think you'll quickly want to use Server Manager. It does the rest. It'll actually install the ADF applications, the foundation. It'll put the INIs and make it easy for you. In Server Manager, it's just click, 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 put a value in, off you go. Otherwise, the manual steps are editing all these INI files, copying things in and out, and doing it that way. But I think it's good reference to have an appreciation of what all Server Manager is doing under the covers for you. But from a runtime architecture, so you've got, like down in the lower left there, that's our traditional Jazz server, HTML server. Everybody, anybody that does E1 has one of those. Then we add the AIS server there on the right. So it's making what's called, like in this example, it's a form service request. It's loading up an application, P01012, says I'm doing address book, I need to get this version, this form, and I need these fields. That's what the AIS server is doing, and it's then using that as a front end to use REST and JSON. So they've leveraged that so that ADF, that server in the upper right, it's running, and it has each of those apps. So the sample app, one could be the Work Center. The other one could be the bill material where used. Another one could be the Orchestrator Studio. So those are all running there. Then typically, again, in development you might not need to do this, but if it's launching an application, it's going to have a session over into a Jazz server. It's got to talk to an AIS server that then talks to a Jazz server. So to give you the quick example, if say I had UX-One and I log in my Jazz session. So I have one right there, just my regular web login. Now if I start doing something with UX-One that's making AIS calls, say a search or task search or a jet graph or any of those type of things, now I have two sessions because the AIS server has to talk to a Jazz server. Then I launch in UX-One an ADF application. Well, now I got three sessions. So if you are turning on all this functionality, it's strongly recommended that you isolate your AIS server over to a separate HTML installation and have ADF pointing to that. That way, you don't go in on that HTML server and increase your web user count from, say, 50 to 150, which might not be so good. You might get a couple calls if you only set it up for max users of 100. Another nice thing is you can actually tweak the timeouts. So you can make the timeouts a little bit less, maybe on the ADF side or the AIS side, so it doesn't hold those resources as long. Things like that. I do that all the time. Again, development instance, if I have 5, 10 users, I don't usually worry about it because most of the instances can handle 50, 100 users. But again, if you're doing more than that, you get to prototype. Definitely when you get to production, you want to have a dedicated HTML instance that AIS and ADF are using. And then again, this might even apply where you separate out for orchestrations. As far as some of the considerations on the install, you can put the Fusion middleware infrastructure, you can put on an existing WebLogic domain. So you get a standard domain, that's what it comes with, and then you have the ability of that domain to extend it, or you can create a separate domain on the same server, or again, you can use a totally separate dedicated server. So me, I tend to like, if they've got the flexibility, if it's a Windows Linux architecture, I like separate servers because it's a little more discrete. You know, I can blow something away, add it back in, copy it, do what I want, and not affect the users, especially if it's production. From the standpoint of if you extend the domain, you basically are just mixing the ADF and that all with it in the same one. It's not that big a deal. Node Manager still talks to that. Node Manager talks on a per domain basis. So a lot of times that's what some people will do, or like I said, a separate server. If you create separate, you do have a little more, it's a little trickier because you may have to have 2 different node managers to manage both domains. There is one little caveat though. If you do happen to put your AIS and your JAS and your ADF all in the same server, they by default use the same JSession ID. So guess what happens? I log in, I bring up the app, and the JSession ID happens where the ADF server logs in. Well, he writes a cookie for JSession ID and overwrites your web JSession ID cookie. And if ever, any of you have ever opened up the web browser and broke 2 tabs to the same environment, and you log out of one, and all of a sudden the other one goes away, it's the same thing. You lost your cookie. So there is a document that you can, in the INIs, specify a different cookie path, different name, so that you can separate those. But you need to be aware of it. So, again, I am emphasizing, though, I brought up the example, try to have a separate JAS server for your ADF AIS. I can't emphasize that enough. Again, development, we can slide on that. But once you get above that, definitely look at separating those out. Again, we talked a little history. 12.1.3 only the Oracle database. Once you get to 12.2.1 and above, it does have Oracle SQL Server for that repository. I do have a couple tidbits here about the OEE. The only thing that is a point, by default, the one when you install a FAT client, it uses encrypted passwords for system. So JD Edwards gives you a little utility that's in your system bin 32 for all the CNCs out there. You can use that reconfigure DBXE, and it just unencrypts the system passwords. You set the password to whatever you want and just leave it like that. That way, Fusion middleware can talk to the database. Otherwise, it was really set up just for JD Edwards for the FAT client or for the deployment server to use it. Again, the later releases, 9.2.1 and above, consider JDK 1.8, because JDK 1.7 is not really getting a lot of security patches. Now, there's some conflicting information out on the support docs. Use 1.7, but 1.8, they've got all the bugs fixed. If you're fairly recent, you'll have those fixes. If you do the WebLogic install, you would get a jar file. There is a separate jar file, and the example I'm using here on the 12.1.3 is it'll have an _infrastructure.jar. So that, again, that's the superset of what you get with just a regular WebLogic jar file. So it's just, you need to make sure you're using that one instead of the generic. The generic's not going to have all the infrastructure pieces in it. The ADF Foundation, they'll run, the ADF apps will run on older WebLogic 12.1.3 or 12.2.1x. But they changed the Orchestrator Studio due to some functionality that's only in 12.2.1x. They don't deliver Orchestrator Studio version 5 or 6. It will not run on 12.1.3 WebLogic. So XML path, again, if you're doing anything that's version 5, version 6, you don't have to worry about the XML path. I'm showing a little bit of the history here. Before UDOs came out in 9.2.1, you had the files were XML files. So you actually had a folder and all this stuff got put into it. And let's say I created them in test and DV. I manually had to go and copy my files from DV to another folder for PY, another folder for production when I would put them in. Of course, with user-defined objects, all this stuff goes away. We don't have to deal with that anymore. But if you happen to be on one of these old releases and you haven't run the upgrade to get your XML files converted to UDOs, you still need this path. So you just need to be aware of it. And here's the part, again, about disabling the HTTP authentication. Just give you the background on it. what you'll find is AIS will work just fine. But if you go in Orchestrator Studio and you try to use the client to test your orchestration, it won't work. You won't be able to sign on. You just get a security error. So you just need to make sure that there's a couple methods. The one I use is just editing the XML file directly and putting that line in yellow in there just to turn off the authentication. But the document that's out there now, they've added another way where you can use WebLogic scripting tool, the WLST, and do it that way as well. But again, it's not the end of the world if you forget it. It just means you can't log in and test your orchestrations with the client. So it is good to follow this step. Configuring it, again, the database repository, it has what's called a repository creation utility, RCU. So RCU is what puts all the schemas, all these tables in for the Fusion middleware infrastructure. So you run this RCU, again, if you're Windows, it's a BAT file. If you're Linux, Unix, it's a SH, shell script. So it goes in, creates it, you answer a bunch of prompts, you give it a prefix for your particular one, give it a password, don't lose your password, otherwise you've got to recreate it all again. Then again, create or extend the domain if you need to. The big thing there, it's just a decision point. If you have the separate servers, just create a domain. But if you're kind of tight and you have to put things together, you can extend one. That works just fine. This is kind of the actual steps, little prompts, reminders. Make sure that you're using a production domain, not development, where it's continuously rehashing and reloading things. It's kind of slow if you run your WebLogic server in development mode versus production mode. Make sure you're using a 64-bit JDK. Again, I gave an example of a SCADA. I put like an ADF prefix in front of it, so I know which ones they are. And again, you can check Node Manager to make sure all that's set up. It does have connection verification, so highly recommend there's a little checkbox. Just say, check my connections. And make sure that it can connect to your database before it puts things in. And I do, but try to note your domain location, the paths, and the URL, so in case it decides, if you have mobile WebLogics, the ports change as it does it. So you might use the wrong port. Normally the port's like 7001, Node Manager's 5556. But if you have multiple ones, it starts increasing. Then a lot of times I like to go into the WebLogic console and just go ahead and define my managed server or the machine. So I put that in there, give it a name, give it a port. And then in the older WebLogic, like 12.1.3, you'd go into what's called the Enterprise Management Console, the EMCC. And you would have to click a button that says, oh, this is the first time in, I need to apply the Java Runtime Facility, the JRF template. It would put that in there. 12.2.1 does this all automatically for you, so you don't have to worry about that step. But again, the JRF is what ADF is using, so it needs that. Then there's another IoT orchestration guide if we're doing the studio. Again, it's download from the Update Center, get the pieces you need there, get your power file, pop it on. You can set your WebLogic environment. Again, this is the manual way, this is the old way. So we're expanding things out. We have to have a command prompt to do that. We set up a build properties file. We have to fill all those fields in. Or at the very bottom there, I say, if you got tools 9212, you download it and you put it in Server Manager and say, load. It does it all for you. But if we're doing it manually, again, there was a build properties file. We had to go in and tell what our host was, what our port was, again, where we're going to, what container we're putting it in, those type of things. Then you'd also have to, from your prompt, you have to wait until you got a build successful message that. I'm going to go through this kind of quick because I'm hoping none of you have to use the manual methods. Again, for an Orchestrator Studio, you do have to have a machine name. So sometimes that gets missed. If you don't have a machine name, Node Manager can't manage, can't start and stop the instance. If Node Manager can't stop and start your instance, that means Server Manager can't stop and start your instance. So it's another one of those little pieces of tying the things together, why you do these things. And then again, if we were doing a deployment, we literally would have to go in on the WebLogic, look at the deployments, put them in there, and make sure it deployed successfully. Then we log in through its special URL, and we get a page. Hopefully everything works right. Did the same thing here. if you were doing the ADF components, I just took you through a bit of Orchestrator Studio. ADF is similar in that there's just a lot more files. So you put them all in a folder. You have a foundation. Both Orchestrator Studio and ADF, they have two places. The foundation, and so the foundation is shared for the Studio and for the ADF apps, and you have applications. Applications being ADF apps or Orchestrator Studio. Again, doing this though, we'd create like a folder called E1 ADF app. We put all the build scripts in there, copy stuff in. You put your jar files in there. Like say, here's an example. These are all the little jar files. You know, in Server Manager, what these are, they're zip files. So you just go and download from the Update Center the ADF section, download the zip files. You don't have to worry about all this piece. You're just going to take them and put them in from managed software, you know, distribute them to your server, and then you'll be able to say load these components, and you just click a checkbox for each one that you want. Again, manual deployment, lots of steps. Notepad, edit it if you're using Windows or text editor, VI, whatever. Got to make sure we get our right post, you know, our host, our port, UX-ADF1. So, you know, again, here just a couple checks, making sure you've got your environment set to your WebLogic properly so that it can access it and build it correctly and deploy it. So there's a build. So Ant is the part that helps you build your web application archive. Then it deploys it, puts it in there, and then it keeps going down. Then you have to start it. Of course, you have to use WebLogic to start it back then. They didn't have ADF servers as a managed instance, so you couldn't do any of this in Server Manager. It wasn't exposed. So Server Manager didn't know about your ADF server. Once you got to 9212, it became aware of ADF servers. So it's managing them, all the nice things that you can do with Server Manager, which is our great friend for making it easier to administer these. You'd use that. Here was a whitelist. So whitelists are a lot of fun. It basically says what URLs can talk to ADF, or there's whitelists also up on the Jazz server on that side as well. Default is nothing gets in. So unfortunately with the ADF, I put a note about it. Supposedly you could put an asterisk like you could on AIS or Jazz. You can say allow all hosts. I've tried that a couple times. I haven't tried it in the latest tools, but so far it doesn't work. It still comes back, and if it's not in that list, the whitelist rejects it. So I'm actually going to reference another document. They've got a nice way now. Oracle put out a very nice support doc on how to use the Chrome browser, so you can call each of the ADF components and make sure you see what URL it's giving you. Because each of these things are, you notice I've got in that whitelist, uppercase, lowercase. When I did this the first time, I had no idea what URL, because this is all based on domain names, host names, things of that, or what somebody puts in an INI. If you're not consistent, it might be uppercase in one place, might be lowercase in another, and if they're not right, even though it's the right name, it won't work because it's case sensitive. So yeah, try not to do server names with upper and lowercase or things like that. It really makes this job a lot more challenging. And again, if we were going to put this all out, we do our Ant build, our Ant deploy, off we go. Then we go in the Jazz instance. We had to configure some of these things to say, you know, that's the whitelist over on the Jazz server. So we have to put those in there as well. That's under the security side of it. There's also what's called in the web runtime, there's a place there where you specify the UX framework. The user experience framework, that's ADF. These pieces here, even though I say it's manual, you would do these over in Server Manager to make it a little bit easier.